Well, we've got Rachel Wheeley here with us just now. How are you today?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing great. So first of all, how would you describe your style of comedy, really?
It's quite self-deprecating and is essentially a release valve for all of the pain that I feel in my body.
And it's kind of interesting because how did you actually get into comedy? Because you were actually working on the Today programme on Radio 4 beforehand, which is quite a different thing.
Yeah, I was doing that. A colleague of mine started doing stand-up comedy and I went to see him and I thought, I'll give this a go.
Yeah. And did you find it hard at first to get into comedy? Because I guess if it's your first time, it can be hard to know what's funny.
Yeah, it is hard to know what's funny. I think I've always been somebody who's tried to make people laugh day to day. So I had quite a lot of practice trying to be funny just between myself and my friends. But when I went and did stand up, it is a really different thing because you've got to connect with people who've never met you before, don't know anything about you. And of course, when you're talking to your friends, a lot of the humor is based on the fact that they know a lot about you and what you're like and what you're likely to think in a given situation. So starting stand-up, I was working out how to convey all of that to people in a very short space of time.
Yeah. And you did a comedy about the Pips on Radio 4. Have you done a lot that's inspired by your own life and work?
Yeah, I think I've always taken things from my life as a jumping off point. I also did a show about bisexuality at Edinburgh in 2019 called The Unfortunate Bisexual. That's based on my life. Yeah. Quite a lot of my jokes are based on having 3 kids. And so, yeah, I definitely take real things as a starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. You've also done a few podcasts as well, and you've got one at the moment called Walk the Pod, which is quite interesting. What's the idea behind that?
So the idea behind that is, would it be helpful to get away from your desk if you do a desk job at lunchtime and have a walk in order to sort of give you an opportunity to allow the stress and anxiety of the morning at work to sort of dissolve away and refreshing you for the afternoon. I started this podcast in November in 2020, and what I'd found was that I wanted to go for a walk at lunchtime, but I just wasn't going. Yeah. So I had to turn it into a performance art piece.
And that's quite interesting. Can we listen to it while we're walking? Is that maybe part of the idea?
That is part of the idea. I'd very much encourage everyone to do that. If you fancy walking at lunchtime and you're finding it difficult to get out the door, you can always use my podcast as a kind of accountability buddy and somewhere to start. So you can sort of think, well, I'm only going to listen to this podcast while I'm out on my lunchtime walk.
Yeah. And walking is a time when you're free to listen to a podcast without any distractions and stuff, isn't it? You have your full concentration.
Yeah. And what I've been encouraging people to do while they're walking is to pay attention to what's directly in front of them. Because we spend a lot of time in our heads thinking about things that have happened in the past and things that have happened in the future, and it can be a source of anxiety for people. Yeah. So taking a walk at lunchtime and committing to spend 10 minutes actually just paying attention to what's around you can be quite a mindful activity.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just feels like when you're walking without listening to something, there's something missing sometimes, isn't there?
It's nice to listen to music as well. I do that quite a lot. Or I ring people, but I think it's what's interesting about it is walking kind of, it really resets your the rhythm of your body quite a lot, and it can stop you from feeling like you're kind of madly trying to get through a load of things, which is how work can feel sometimes. So it's quite a nice kind of reset halfway through the day, just to get that time to spend paying attention to what's in front of you. And it's also an opportunity to connect with nature. I don't know where you live, Toby, but I live in quite an urban area. And I'm at work kind of 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. You can get very disconnected with what season it is, what weather there is around, what's going on with the local nature. So walking around means that I'm much more connected with what flowers are out at the moment, or what the kind of direction of travel is in terms of how long the day is and things like that. And one of the things I like about it is it's kind of moving against a real homogenization of time, which happens in offices, because we're getting to a point now where everything is available all the time. You can get a sandwich at 3 a.m. You can go and do a yoga class at 7 o'clock on a Sunday evening. You can do anything whenever you want. Modern technology means that you can have any kind of experience at any time of day. It doesn't really, and we get very disconnected from the actual kind of the world and how it works.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, during this pandemic, walking has been one of the only things we've been allowed to do during the lockdowns. So have you found that listenership has been bigger than it maybe would have been if you'd have started the podcast more than 2 years ago?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yes, I think so. It's quite difficult to tell because I haven't started a podcast in a well, I have actually, but not the same kind of thing. Yeah. But I definitely think that people have had an opportunity to sort of get into it more than perhaps they might have in another year.
Yeah. And how's the pandemic been overall as a stand-up comedian? Because for most of it, I guess you wouldn't have been able to do big performances.
Yeah, no, it's actually been a really sad time for stand-up comedians in a lot of ways, because I think a lot of the work has disappeared, and some more enterprising comedians, or perhaps I should say people who are more committed to stand-up comedy than I am, have done lots and lots of online gigs for audiences. I actually haven't done that. I've kind of changed, pivoted, you might say, to being a podcaster instead of a comedian. And I'm hoping to get back to live performance when I can do actual on-stage, in-person gigs again.
Yeah. And what is it about the online gigs that you didn't want to do? Were you just not interested? Was it as simple as that?
I think it's a really different activity.
Yeah.
You know, you have to work out how to do that from scratch. And I was concentrating on other things at the time. I was just kind of focusing on, I was homeschooling through the pandemic, and I was trying to find a permanent job and stuff like that. So it just wasn't really the time to kind of throw myself into working out how to do something like that. Yeah. But I know that a lot of comics have really made it work for them.
Yeah. Well, have you got anything planned coming up in terms of comedy things, or just more podcast episodes?
I'm doing more podcast episodes. I'm hoping to go to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in August, which is quite a way away, but I'm kind of hoping that might be a time to get back to doing some live performance, and hoping that by that time it might be possible in terms of pandemic-y things as well.
Yeah, that's interesting, because the Fringe happened last year, but I didn't go, which is like the first time in ever, and I think my understanding is it wasn't exactly the same.
No, I think it was a very much scaled down version, and they did quite a lot of hybrid shows, I believe, so it was probably an opportunity to play around with some ideas that they might not have done in other years, and I'm sure a lot's been learnt from it, but I think everybody's really looking forward to it being in person again, and I hope that can happen this summer.
Yeah, and I guess the thing is, a lot of it is sort of outside. There's all sorts of street performances going on, and I think the science is that it's unlikely that you're going to catch anything outside, but then I don't know if you can do the outside stuff without the inside stuff.
Yeah, I think it's probably the inside stuff that was completely impossible. And I just hope that when we go there in the summer that it'll all be able to happen again. But the Fringe is wonderful because there's so many different types of thing going on. Like there's kind of whole Fringe festivals going on during the Fringe Festival now.
Yeah.
You know, there's the comedy festival, but then there's also street performances, and then there's also kids shows running as well. And it is just a really amazing atmosphere. So I hope we can get back to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, where can we keep up to date with you and find your podcast and websites and things?
The best thing to do is to go to walkthepod.com, and you'll be able to find the latest episodes there. I'm currently recording series 23 of the podcast. I also have Patreon. If you go to rachelwheeleyisfunny.com, I have a Patreon page there. People can sign up to my my little walking community. We do kind of walking events. We've got one tomorrow, in fact. And I also write newsletters. You can sign up for my newsletter, rachelwheeley.substack.com, if you'd like to.
Great. Well, thanks very much for joining us today. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks very much for having me.